In a move that stunned Capitol Hill Thursday, House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy, the heavy favorite to replace John Boehner, withdrew his candidacy for Speaker of the House. McCarthy shocked colleagues at the start of a closed-door meeting, telling them he didn't believe he was the right person for the job, and recommending the election be postponed for the good of party unity.
As if Republicans needed it, they've got a full-scale war going on in their own House. Words such as dysfunctional and banana republic are being tossed around in the wake of Kevin McCarthy's announcement he would not be seeking the Speaker of the House. There are battle lines being drawn, and honestly, Democrats could not be happier, because every time Republicans spit publicly, they believe it only makes their job of winning the White House easier. All right, some perspective then. Our guest has been serving the people of Pennsylvania's 15th Congressional District for a decade. He is smack dab in the middle of what has shaken Washington. Pleasure to welcome Congressman Charlie Dent to the Hardline. Congressman, a pleasure to have you here in what has got to be a shaky time right now inside the Beltway. But I guess the first question is the Republican Party, as some people are charging, eating its young, its old, and everyone in between right now?
Well, thank you, Ed, for having me on the program. But I would say right now the issue is that we obviously are going through a very turbulent time. There's some factions within the House, but fundamentally what this comes down to is this: do we have the capacity for governance? And many of my colleagues and I are having this discussion about the next speaker must restore functionality to the House of Representatives.
But here's a question, I guess, because what you're talking about, the capacity of governance, you and your colleagues, you are there to govern. You are elected to be there to govern. So the American people are then going to be asking, how did it get this bad? Because that's your job. That's the job of people here, to make sure that you govern and get along.
Well, how did it get this way? Good question. But the reality is, what I try to point out to everyone who will listen, is that in order to pass important legislation, we typically need a bipartisan coalition to get those bills through the House, whether it was the fiscal cliff, Hurricane Sandy relief, the Violence Against Women's Act, the appropriations process, opening the government, reopening the government when it's shut down, stopping the government from defaulting on its obligations. These all require bipartisan coalitions, and that will be the path forward. Just last week, we had a vote on a continuing resolution to fund the government. It was a bipartisan coalition in both the House and the Senate that made it happen. That's what will happen again. So the next speaker, it's not about who the next speaker will be. The question is, can we change the underlying political dynamic or the governing dynamic that got us in this situation?
Then what is it going to take to change that dynamic? Because, frankly, as I pointed out, Democrats are they're just rubbing their hands together right now saying, you guys go ahead and just kill each other off. We'll have a great time about it. And the American public doesn't believe that the people are in Washington right now who can put it all together and get along and govern.
Well, I have said from the get-go, we have an important responsibility as elected officials, and we have to properly function. We must demonstrate that we have the capacity to do the most basic functions of government. That is, keep it operating, keep it funded, and make sure we don't default on our obligations. Very basic things. We're going to have to also deal with hurricane relief, I suspect, for what's happened down in South Carolina. But we have some very basic things we must deal with. And so, to the extent that we fail in our ability to function, the American people will judge us very harshly. So I am imploring my colleagues on my side of the aisle, and certainly on the Democratic side of the aisle too, but that we have to demonstrate that we can pass the bills that we must pass. When we have some folks who have a very difficult time getting to yes, they kind of think the perfect is always the enemy of the good. Any kind of cooperation or collaboration with the other side is a sellout or a capitulation or a surrender. That makes governing very difficult.
Let me do this. I've only got 30 seconds left.
Yeah.
Do you agree with Peter King when he says the Freedom Caucus is the problem here and they want to hijack this party and blackmail the House?
Well, what I agree with is that that caucus, the Freedom Caucus, typically does represent the more rejectionist wing of the party. That's the group that has a much harder time getting to yes. But it is not just that group. There are other members, unfortunately, who sometimes will be pushed in the direction of the Freedom Caucus, and that's what we have to work on, trying to get those other 100 or so members, moving in the right direction, which they typically do. I've often said there are 200 members of the House Republican Conference who do have an affirmative sense of governance and understand the responsibility to get things done.
And we're going to have to stop there. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Congressman Charlie Dent, but we're going to be back in touch with you to see if indeed everybody can put things together in Washington.